Encounters with tribes of Uncontacted pose the same question. Why resist all outsiders? Where are the last of the uncontacted tribes? Let's look no further than in the infamous Bay of Bengal between India and Myanmar. We have a coveted islands of paradise known as the Andaman Islands. The Andaman Islands are home to many indigenous tribes, many that have now been reached and somewhat modernized to some level. But off the capital island in South Andaman, just 22 miles west, we find an island of paradise known as North Sentinel Island. But unlike the other Andaman tribes, the people of North Sentinel Island have remained completely cut off from the outside world. No technology, no trade, no outsiders. For thousands of years, they've lived in absolute isolation and they fiercely protected. So much so that anyone who dares step foot on their shores may never come back alive. So by the end of this video, you'll know every recorded encounter with the mysterious North Sentinelese, from colonial officers in the 1800s to shipwreck convicts and even modern day intrusions. But stay with me until the very end, because the wildest encounter of all is one that even today, no one can fully explain. Before we even get to the first European record of the Sentinelese, we need to go back, way back. Anthropologists believe that around 60,000 years ago, early humans migrated out of Africa, moving slowly across Asia. This is when supposed sea levels were way lower. And here on the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal is where many ended up. Civilizations like Egypt, Greece, and Rome rose and collapsed, while empires fought world wars and split the atom, the atomic bomb, World War II. The Sentinelese remained isolated, preserving a hunter-gatherer way of life that has maybe only changed very little. We can't take DNA samples from them because outsiders can't get close, but genetic studies of neighboring tribes of like the Onge, the Jarwa, and the Great Andamanese suggest that the Sentinelese are among the oldest continuous populations on Earth. Think about that. While the rest of the world has been racing through history, this tribe has been living on the same small patch of land, fishing, hunting, and surviving in near total isolation. And then, in 1771, their existence was officially noted in the history books. The British survey ship Diligent sailed past a small island thick with the forest. From the deck, crew members spotted something strange: smoke rising into the sky. They knew it meant one thing: people were there. But they didn't land. They didn't see anyone. They simply recorded the sighting and moved on. It was just a passing note in a logbook, but it was the first written proof of Sentinelese in history, the first crack in their invisible wall of isolation. And it raised a question that would haunt outsiders for centuries. Who were these people? Almost a century after that first mysterious sighting of smoke, the island revealed itself in a far more dramatic way. In 1867, the Indian merchant ship the Nineveh struck a reef near North Sentinel Island. More than 100 passengers and crew scrambled ashore, stranded on the beach like out of a movie of a shipwreck. Imagine it, wreckage scattered across the sand, supplies running low, no idea if rescue would ever come. Straight out of a Hollywood film. At first, things were eerily quiet. The dense jungle behind them gave no sign of life, but the silence didn't last. From the trees, figures emerged, dark silhouettes, with bows drawn, arrows tipped and ready. The Sentinelese, without a word, the arrows flew. The castaways threw up makeshift defenses, huddling together, desperately trying to hold out. They grabbed stones and whatever they could to defend themselves. For them, this was a nightmare, being hunted by an invisible enemy they couldn't understand. For the Sentinelese, it was something else entirely. Strangers had washed up on their shore and they weren't welcome. It was like some alien ship had landed and these strange aliens were taking up and taking over their lands. For days, the crew of the Nineveh fought to survive. Every moment toward the jungle was met with a volley of arrows. Every attempt to signal for help went unanswered. They were trapped. Finally, a passing Royal Navy rescue ship spotted the wreckage and pulled the survivors to safety. The world's newspapers later described the Sentinelese as, unfortunately, hostile savages, a tribe that seemed to kill without reason. But seen from their perspective, they were defending their home, an island passed down for thousands of years suddenly invaded by over 100 desperate strangers. In this pattern, outsiders calling them brutal, while the Sentinelese simply saw themselves as protectors. This is where you will get the idea that they're known as cannibals, which again originates then, has been carried on ever since. But the first real description of the Sentinelese would forever leave its mark. Dark colored skin, naked with painted red noses, and screaming. The screaming they heard was something along like pa an oh over and over again. Pa an oh. And the things would only get worse for the Sentinelese after this point on. By the late 1800s, the British Empire had tightened its grip on the Indian Ocean. They were becoming the global power, owning lands from Canada, Australia, Africa, India, and what other regions that would equate to 1/5 of Earth's surface. And with the empire came curiosity about the strange, hidden tribes of the Andaman Islands, an area they now owned. That curiosity led to Maurice Vidal Portman, a young colonial officer, explorer, and self-styled anthropologist. He was raised on Port Blair, which is the capital of the Andaman Islands, only 22 miles west of North Sentinel. Portman, a very complicated and bizarre figure, as you'll come to find out, was assigned with cataloging the Andaman tribes by the British government and India. He was paid to do this, and some of it he paid for himself. However, from the catalog, it was clear he was obsessed with the Andamans in a very weird way, because he took thousands, not hundreds, thousands of photos. The photos, which you can see on the screen, show adults and kids against checkered boards. His obituary explains that he considered himself a, quote, homosexual, but never released this until after he had died. So it wasn't public knowledge. But at the time, he was in charge of these Andaman figures. And it kind of shows the clear interest in the male Andamanese body that he took many photos of. In his journals, he reported he was obsessed with their penis size, and one can infer some of the images were probably for his own homoerotic pleasures. However, I digress. So in the 1800s and 1890s, he turned his attention to the most mysterious tribe of them all, the Sentinelese. Portman led an armed expedition to the island, and during this one mission, his men captured 6 Sentinelese people, 2 elderly adults and 4 children. From his personal journals, it's a bit weird, it differs, but it's reported he stole 6 people, which included an old man, an old woman, and 4 kids. It's reported Portman kept them in his Port Blair house for days. What happened next was tragic and entirely predictable. Within days, the 2 elders became violently ill, exposed to diseases their bodies had never encountered. If you read the book Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, this explains it all. Because realizing they were soon gonna die, they took the children who were falling ill, and Portman had taken them back with some gifts. He was hoping when he returned them back to North Sentinel Island, it would be a way of showing that, he was trying to befriend them and he wasn't trying to be so mean, and he apologized for what happened. Instead, what this really did was likely convince the Sentinelese that outsiders were dangerous and deadly. Historians believe this disastrous encounter in the 1890s is one of the main reasons the Sentinelese remain so hostile and resistant to outsiders to this day. They learned early on that contact often meant sickness and death. It was the first true contact with the Sentinelese, and it ended in death and being captured, something that is horrible, and showed them that these outsiders were going to abuse them. For the British, they saw it as just a failed experiment. For the Sentinelese, it was a warning. Every outsider carried the invisible threat of sickness and extinction. And this wasn't just paranoia. Other tribes in the Andaman, the Great Andamanese, the Onge, and the Jarwa, had already been devastated by colonial contact. Thousands were wiped out by smallpox, measles, and influenza. Entire cultures collapsed in a single generation. So what happened in 1896 was no surprise to the British in Port Blair, but would disturb audiences back home for decades to come. In August of 1896, a convict named Dwan Singh, sometimes just recorded in colonial reports as an escaped prisoner, broke free from the penal settlement at Port Blair. Britain had already been using the Andaman since the mid-19th century as an isolated outpost to what? Kind of like a prison, to house criminals, rebels, and political prisoners, especially after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, but we're not going to go into that. The conditions there were brutal. They had forced labor, disease often hit them, and starvation was super common. So escape attempts, though rare, weren't unheard of. Singh managed to steal a small raft or makeshift canoe and set out into the Bay of Bengal. He eventually drifted across the waters and he landed on North Sentinel. Likely exhausted and desperate for food or shelter, but instead of finding safety, Singh had stepped into what the colonial records later described as a death trap. A few days later, a search party from Port Blair spotted his body laying on the sands of North Sentinel. His corpse told the story. His chest and body were punctured with arrows, and his throat had been slit. A clear sign the Sentinelese had executed him deliberately. Unlike random shipwreck sailors who sometimes slipped away, Singh had been decisively killed and left in plain view, as if to send a warning to anyone who might follow and do the same and come onto this island. For the outside world, the story cemented the island's pop reputation as simply a place you just did not go. The Sentinelese may have learned that lesson faster than anyone else. From that point on, their hostility towards outsiders wasn't just instinct, it was survival. The story of the Sentinelese doesn't just pause after the colonial era. It takes a darker, more mysterious turn. During World War II, the Andaman Islands fell under Japanese rule and occupation. From 1942 to 1945, Port Blair became a strategic outpost for Japan in the Bay of Bengal. As the Japanese tightened their grip, much of the British colonial record on the islands were destroyed. What we're left with is an unsettling silence. Did the Japanese attempt to make contact with the Sentinelese? Did they clash with them, or did they wisely steer clear of the island altogether? No one really knows, and most likely they stayed clear because they were focused on fighting the Allied powers. That gap in history, though, leaves us wondering what exactly happened to the Sentinelese during those years of occupation. Did many of them die out? Did they see the Japanese? Did they have any encounters? To see what happens to them, we must look at the monumental moment in history when India gained independence in 1947. Control of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands shifted from Britain to the new Indian government. For the first time in centuries, decisions about these remote tribes were not made by a foreign power, but by a nation still finding its footing. Then, less than a decade later, in 1956, India passed the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of the Aboriginal Tribes Regulation. This law declared the islands, including North Sentinel, as tribal reserves. Outsiders were strictly forbidden from approaching without government approval. They wanted to protect them. They realized there was history here. The reasoning was simple but critical: to prevent violent confrontations and, more importantly, to shield the tribe from diseases that could wipe them out in a single wave. This was a turning point. For the first time, the law recognized the Sentinelese not as a people to be studied, converted, or conquered, but as a people who deserved to be left alone. But instead, people wanted to study them. At the front of that effort was Dr. Triloknath Pandit, an anthropologist with the Indian government. In 1967, he led the first official expedition to North Sentinel for study purposes. But Dr. Pandit tried something different. Instead of sending only outsiders, he brought along members of the Onge tribe from nearby Little Andaman. If anyone could make contact, he thought, it would be the Onge Islanders themselves and distant relatives of the Sentinelese, because he thought they might be related. The plan was simple. The Onge would call out in their own language, hoping for recognition. On the beach, they raised their voices, greetings carried across the sand, words meant to sound familiar. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadow of the jungle, once again, the Sentinelese appeared. Again, bows drawn, arrows ready. Their answer was not welcome, but warning. The Onge kept shouting, trying to connect in some way, repeating phrases, gesturing with their open hands, but the Sentinelese gave no sign of understanding. No shared words, no shared bond. Finally, the Sentinelese had sent an arrow which thudded into the sand at their feet. The message was unmistakable. You need to leave. The team withdrew. The attempt had failed. And in that failure came a revelation. The Sentinelese weren't just cut off from the modern world. They were cut off even from their own cousins. Their language and culture had diverged so far that even the Onge, once kin, were now strangers. It was a sobering lesson, and yet just a few years later, another group of outsiders would arrive, cameras in hand, determined to capture the first images of the world's most mysterious tribe. So by the 1970s, the mystery of North Sentinel Island had become irresistible to the outside world. Anthropologists, explorers, and even filmmakers all wanted the same thing: a glimpse into the lives of the most isolated tribe on Earth. A team from National Geographic, along with anthropologists and police, visited the island to film a documentary. This documentary we all know today is known as Man in Search of Man. And for the first time ever, the world was about to see the most isolated tribe on Earth caught on film. The 1974 North Sentinel expedition was organized and led by Dr. Pandit again, who, as I mentioned, is an Indian anthropologist working with the Anthropological Survey of India. Pandit had already spent years studying the indigenous tribes of the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands, and was considered one of India's foremost experts on the uncontacted tribes. The Indian government tasked him with leading the mission because of his experience in the field of anthropology, and National Geographic partnered with the effort to capture footage for their documentary, Man in Search of Man. It was going to be a combined effort. The crew came prepared though. They had police armed with rifles, a boat filled with gifts, and cameras ready to capture history. Their plan again was simple: approach the shore, leave gifts, then film whatever happened next. These were the gifts. Coconuts, highly valued by the island tribes in the Andaman, since they don't naturally grow on North Sentinel. They also left aluminum and iron tools, pots, pans, and metal items thought to be useful and attractive. Then they also left cloth, small bundles of fabric. They then left a live pig, a gift intended as a food offering. They also left toy dolls, which were symbolic gifts meant to show friendliness. The plan was going perfectly. They arrived on shore in a small boat as seen in the footage above. They made landfall like conquistadors a few hundred years before, making their first marks on civilization, dropping the gifts and looking into the jungle if anyone was there. After the gifts were placed on the sand, the tension didn't ease. Dr. Pandit and his team spotted the Sentinelese warriors hidden along the tree line, again with their bows drawn. Then, without warning, the first arrow hissed through the air, striking into the beach near the operants. More arrows followed in rapid succession, fired with remarkable accuracy and force. One arrow found its mark though. Pune-based filmmaker Umesh Chandra Pandit, who was directing the documentary crew, not related to Dr. Pandit, was struck in the thigh. The arrow pierced deep, sending him collapsing into the sand. His colleagues were shouting in panic as more arrows rained down, forcing them to abandon their equipment. The Indian policemen who had come along for protecting raised their rifles, but this is where it kind of is unfortunate, but they were under strict orders. No shots fired unless lives were in immediate danger. I guess getting shot was not immediate danger. So they held back, covering the retreat, but never pulling the trigger. The crew scrambled to drag the injured director back to the boat, and in the chaos, arrows splashed into the water all around them, some sticking into the side of the wooden craft, which shows you the power of the actual arrows, as they pushed off from the beach. Miraculously, no one else was hit. They managed to row out of range and tend to the wounded filmmaker who survived the attack, but carried the scar as a permanent reminder of what happened. For the National Geographic team, the mission was effectively over and not as successful as they hoped. The Sentinelese had rejected the gifts. They rejected the cameras and made their stance violently clear. Outsiders were not welcome. And then if you've seen the movie Man Search for Man, the footage from the 1974 expedition doesn't actually show the attack itself, and here's why. When the attack began, the crew panicked and dropped their equipment to pull the injured director to safety. Cameras were abandoned in the rush, so there was no continuous filming during the chaos. So when you actually watch the documentary, the only usable footage they carried back from the moments before were boats approaching, gifts being placed on the beach, and the distant shots after the attack of the Sentinelese on the shore. Later in the documentary, the narration explains the hostility and the injury, but the actual arrow striking the director is not on film. The Sentinelese response after seeing the gift was also fascinating, but chilling. They killed and buried the pig instead of eating it, as far as we know. They took coconuts, but ignored most of the other items. Then, when the crew tried to film the Sentinelese warriors, opened fire with arrows. For most, this should have been the end of the story, the final warning that any future contact attempt would be reckless, even insane. And yet, it wasn't. Because only a few years later, fate itself would bring outsiders crashing into North Sentinel, stranded, unarmed, and at the mercy of the very people who wanted them gone. So that ends part 1 of the North Sentinel people. Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe. Love to hear your thoughts. My name is Alessi, and I will see you in the next one.